It seems as if we are in a golden age for bearing our soul. It's the age of memoirs, biographies, autobiographies. These books seems to be pouring out of the wormwood, like honey flowing out of the honeycombs. So it seems that we're in, let's say, this golden age for bearing our soul. In your case, it's speaking my soul, but we'll come to the variation in a little while. Welcome to Oral Tradition, and welcome to another adventure in Guyanese literature. On this adventure, we take a look at language, life, race, or to give the title of the book, Speaking My Soul, Race, Life, and Language by Professor John Russell Rickford. Professor, welcome to Oral Tradition.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and welcome to Guyana again.
You know, I can see the library behind you. I spent many hours inside that library as a child.
I can imagine that. We'll talk about that when we talk about your formative days because we'll talk about your love for reading, your love for poetry. But let's follow the book. The book opens with a turning point in your life, a life that is filled with many, as it were, turning points, many transformative moments. Right? It's it is like a work of art. Your book is like a work of art where the reader is looking for transformation of the character from one end to the other end. Talk about your book, Speaking My Soul. How would you speak your soul? What instrument would you use to speak your soul?
Well, in this case, it was writing, but you know, the book began with my talking about my stroke, which I had in September 2019. And in fact, there was a moment when I lost my voice altogether. I didn't have any voice. It was about a day when I was in hospital, in Stanford Hospital. And that was terrifying to me, um, not to have my voice. And it was in an attempt to, I guess that stroke made me aware of my mortality because my father had died from a stroke. Two of my three brothers died from a stroke. And I was aware that, you know, I was mortal.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to put forth some facts about my life and my story, first of all, for my children. But
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, once a publisher got interested, then I wrote it up as a book. You know.
You know, if you do like this and browse the book, it's filled with poetry.
It was, oh, poetry, yes, that's
Yeah,
true. Yeah.
poetry. Apart from the notes that you have there at the end of each chapter, let's talk about poetry for a little while. I was thinking perhaps you could have done an epic poem about your life instead of doing it in prose,
Well,
like
you
Johnny.
know, Igad, yes, Igad wrote my foreword. Um, I could have, but you know, I started in literature because when I went up to the States in 1968, you know, I didn't know what linguistics. All I knew was literature,
Yeah.
and I began in literature, but I discovered linguistics. the study of language, the scientific study of language. And I had a professor who worked on Solomon Islands pigeon in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And there were so many similarities between that and Guyanese Creole that I was intrigued and I wanted to understand more about Guyanese Creole and so on. And linguistics was a brand new, not linguistics as such, but sociolinguistics, the study of language and society, was brand new. It had just been started a few years before that. And so I changed to doing that. And in fact, my plan was originally to work on methods of improving teachers' understanding of Creolese, how to use Creolese in teaching them standard English and helping them do better in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that changed over time for me.
Yeah, yeah. Let's move forward quickly. They talking about using Creoles to teach in the classroom. I remember reading, I think it was Jamaican Syntax by Beryl Loftman
Daily,
Daly. Yes,
yeah,
where she
very
said,
often.
"How can you teach, um, 3, 4 years old and 5 year old standard English, right? By
Yeah,
going
yeah.
to standing in it just like that. Why don't you teach them in the innate language, the Creolese, all right? And that's a valid point. Let's go back to something you said about your voice, losing your voice. Losing your voice meant you had no language as such,
Mm.
and it was frightening. You said. So what
It
do we
made me cry.
use? Beg your pardon?
I said it made me cry because it was
Yeah.
totally astonishing, you know.
Yeah. What do we use language for? And I know, for one, we use language for identity. So you use your language, if you lose your language, you sort of lose your identity. And we'll talk a lot about language and identity in your book. Do we use the language for, or a language for?
Yeah. Well, obviously we use it to communicate um, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what we're worrying about, what we're dreaming about. Um, but the language we use also marks who we are and what we are, you know, as people. So part of our identity. And I should say that I met during the course of being in hospital and being in a rehab center, I met several people who no longer had language. They had lost their language completely. So I was fortunate that I got back my language, like maybe the next day.
Good for us, good for you, good for your family, and good for the world, because you're sort of you are an authority in variation of Creolese, which you did your PhD in, variation
Yeah,
of Creolese continuum, all right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you had some great teachers. Let's talk about your formative days.
Yeah.
Your first awareness of language, your first awareness of, I'm following your book, race, life, and language.
And
Let's go back to
yes,
your formative days. Uh,
yes,
how you became aware of these elements, race, especially race, and language.
yes, yeah. Well, race and language. The language part was, you know, my mother used to read to me. She used to read to us, both my brothers and sisters, and uh, she used to read some books that would have uh, remember Samuel Selvon wrote a book called The Lonely Londoners.
Yeah,
The Lonely
yeah.
Londoners. He wrote a series of great books. And in this book, he used to use, you know, Trinidad Creole, which was similar to Guyanese Creole in some ways. And I was intrigued by that. Then I had a couple of teachers at QC, C.A. Janssen, Yango, as you would
Yango.
say,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote random remarks on Creolese. Uh, you know, Yango. suppose, like many people in Ghana, he would speak in high flown standard English, and then he would speak in Creolese, which is all soft.
Yep.
But I came to read his work later on, and his analysis of variation in Creole pronouns in Guyana turned out to be almost exactly what I discovered later on,
Hmm.
10, 20 years later.
What made you aware at this early age that um, these were my first colonial thoughts, first lessons in genealogy and things like that, first lesson in race.
My aunt used to tell me that my great my great grandfather was a Scotsman.
Yeah.
Um, I never met him, of course. In fact, I've been trying to, to trace him, but I can't get much information. Um, and so they would emphasize that, but it was kind of strange. They would talk about this Scotsman, um, but when I look at my family, I saw my mother and some of my sisters using hot comb to straighten their hair. You know, I said, but how come he's a Scotsman and the hair, so to speak, is hard? Why do you have to use a hot comb to straighten your hair?
Mm-hmm.
And I came to realize until much later that this uh, this Scotsman had either married or I would say cohabitated with a mixed race woman from Barbados, you know.
Uh-huh.
So she was part of the black in the family on, on, on my mother's side, but she was never acknowledged. Up to now, I don't know her name.
Uh-uh.
I've gone to Barbados, I've tried to find out the records, but without a marriage certificate, which haven't been able to obtain from the Guyana archives, which, by the way, are not as good and reliable as the Barbados archives.
Oh boy.
I can't trace that connection. And
Mm-hmm.
then, of course, on my father's side, um, I had um, Rickford was apparently a person who owned the Figura estate up in Berbice. And in fact, so she would know at Berbice High School, I think, one of the houses was named Rickford House. But he, again, also cohabitated with a East Indian indentured woman called, we found out, called
Uh-huh.
Parvati. But she raised my great grandfather, my grandfather, and his brother. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in actual fact, when I did DNA later on, about 34% of my ancestry was African, and about 13% was Indian. Um, and so people like Dr. Kerry, you know, Frank Kerry, and so on, they're descendants of poverty. And so, actually, you mentioned Dickinson Ali. Um, he is married to one of Kerry's daughters.
Ah.
So we connected through that side of the family.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
he was a remarkable man who gave birth to several children who went on to become doctors and dentists and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I wasn't at that stage really looking for my ancestry, but it was a lot more complicated than what my aunt around the corner told me,
Ha, ha.
and
I
that's
can
part of
imagine.
what it told in the book. Yeah,
I
yeah,
can imagine that. I can imagine. Transformation,
yes.
turning points in your life. How I fell in love with linguistics and black talk. We can also look at the shiki in suitcase if required.